Hey guys, tonight we begin our journey not with chandeliers or champagne flutes, but with steam, wooden benches, and the soft clatter of tin mugs. This story unfolds deep in the underbelly of a ship once hailed as the greatest marvel of its time, the RMS Titanic. But forget the image of aristocrats in pearls sipping consommé beneath carved ceilings. We're going somewhere quieter, humbler, and far more human. We're stepping into third class. When you boarded Titanic with your third-class ticket, your expectations weren't high. You hoped for a mattress that didn't share company with vermin, a floor that was more wood than mud, and a plate of food that didn't wiggle. You'd heard tales, some exaggerated, some not, about steerage passengers in other ships herded into the dark bowels like cargo, sleeping beside crates and coughing livestock. You didn't expect dignity, you prayed for survival. But as you stepped into the third-class dining saloon on F-deck, something changed. You blinked. Not in disbelief, but in adjustment. The space before you was civilized. A long, bright room stretched out, filled with sturdy wooden tables and matching benches. No hay, no filth, no bucket in the corner trying to pass as a toilet. The air, while thick with the scent of boiled vegetables and soap, held no stench of desperation. The floor beneath your feet wasn't earthen but tiled, neat and clean, with patterns arranged not just for function, but for appearance. And above your head, light streamed from electric bulbs. Electric. Not candles jammed into hollowed turnips, not oil lamps swinging with the ship's movement, but wired lights glowing with quiet authority, casting a glow not just on the walls, but on your assumptions. This wasn't the steerage of legend. This was something else. You found yourself walking a little straighter. You took a seat at one of the long tables, sliding in beside strangers, speaking languages you didn't recognize. One murmured in Sicilian, another adjusted a scarf with Nordic fingers. A child, somewhere behind you, let out a whoop of laughter as he banged a spoon against the table like a drum. This wasn't luxury, not by a long shot, but it was order. Cleanliness. It was a place where meals were served at specific times by men in uniform who didn't bark orders, but nodded politely and moved efficiently, their arms full of bowls and bread. No one handed you a menu, of course. This wasn't a restaurant. It was more like a great, floating kitchen with seats and ceremony, where your presence was acknowledged, your hunger assumed, and your humanity respected. You didn't choose your meal. There were no salmon options, no duck, no dilemma between sauces. But what you received came hot, stew thick with root vegetables, slices of coarse bread that could double as weapons if needed, a pat of something pretending to be butter, and always tea, strong, brown, unwavering tea. At your table, everyone ate with a quiet focus. Elbows bumped, spoons scraped. A Swedish man offered a nod. A woman next to him blessed her bread with a whisper. There was no background music, no tinkling piano like in the first-class salons. But there was conversation in many dialects, stories told with hand gestures and hopeful smiles. There was laughter when the child dropped their spoon again. There was silence between bites. But mostly, there was something unfamiliar to many aboard. Dignity. Because in a world that rarely paused to care for the poor, where the journey itself was often more perilous than the destination, the Titanic's third-class dining saloon offered something radical. It treated the working poor like people. You were not freight, you were not livestock, you were not something to be endured or avoided. You were here, eating with cutlery, sitting on a bench, surrounded by others who, like you, carried dreams wrapped in old coats and packed in suitcases that still smelled of sea salt and farewells. This was no feast. The stew was modest, the bread hard, and the tea sometimes tasted faintly of iron. But the fact that it existed at all, that someone had built a room where the least privileged on board could eat together under electric light, felt quietly revolutionary. For the first time in a long time, you were fed not just with food, but with the faint promise that maybe, just maybe, you belonged in this future that waited on the other shore. In third class, eating was never just eating. It was timing, instinct, and a sort of unspoken choreography. With more than 700 passengers sharing a dining space meant for a fraction of that, the ship's kitchen couldn't simply ring a bell and expect order to descend. Instead, it relied on something older than any printed schedule: collective awareness. One person would stand, another would follow. Someone would mention it was time, and before long, a wave of movement would swell through the hallway and into the dining saloon. It was your turn. You didn't question how it worked. You just moved when others moved, sliding into place like a gear in a great machine. The moment you sat, the pressure clock began ticking. No one told you how long you had. They didn't need to. The rhythm of it all made the timing clear. Eat now, talk later. The stew isn't getting any warmer, and the person behind you is already eyeing your seat like a hawk. Those who arrived early were the lucky ones. Their bread was soft enough to tear without injury. Their soup was still steaming. Their spoons hadn't yet collected the grime of 3 previous owners. They sat with the discipline of seasoned travelers, elbows tight, spoons swift, eyes on their bowls. There was a quiet grace to it, a kind of efficiency learned not from etiquette lessons, but from scarcity. The next group, the middle shift, your group, always got what might be called the lukewarm experience. Not quite fresh, not yet decayed. The stew had begun to congeal slightly. The bread leaned more toward brick than bun, and the chairs had a wobble to them like they'd already hosted a dozen tired backs. Still, it was food. You convinced yourself, the chew built jaw strength, that the blandness was calming. You didn't complain. You just ate. And then there were the stragglers. They came in like shadows after the main event, the last shift, the stew survivors. By the time they arrived, the dining room had quieted, but not in a peaceful way, more like the aftermath of a minor storm. Breadcrumbs scattered like dry leaves, empty mugs abandoned like relics. Their food, if one could call it that, was a whisper of its former self. Tea that tasted more like mop water than comfort, and stew that clung to the plate with the tenacity of regret. These passengers moved slowly, as if mourning not just the meal but their place in the queue of life. Still, they smiled, nodded, took what they were given, and found comfort in the ritual of it all. Conversation, when it happened, was brief and utilitarian. No one waxed poetic about the texture of the bread or mused about the mysteries of cabbage. The words that passed between diners were often simple, even cryptic. Pass the spoon. This one's still warm. Is that carrot? The answers didn't matter. You chewed, you swallowed, you nodded. Yet in all this rush and routine, a strange satisfaction grew, because this wasn't chaos. It was structure. And in the lives of many who had lived with too little structure for too long, in tenements, in fields, on ships bound elsewhere, this was a kind of luxury. Food arrived hot, it arrived on time. No one shouted, no one hit you, and the spoon more or less matched the fork. In a world that often treated the poor as a nuisance or worse, this saloon, tiled and electric lit, was something close to revolutionary. When your time was up, you didn't need to be told. A steward's glance, a faint cough behind your back, or the gentle scraping of someone's shoes near your bench was enough. You stood, cleared your plate, and stepped aside. Not out of fear or shame, but as part of the unwritten agreement between passengers. Everyone got their turn, everyone passed the torch. You returned to your bunk not full in the traditional sense, but satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with flavor. You'd been fed, you'd shared a table with strangers, you'd played your part in the great humming engine of the Titanic's underworld, and you'd done so without losing your dignity. And perhaps, just perhaps, you left with a new appreciation for stew. For its endless forms, its refusal to be anything but itself, and its strange ability to taste like a story you've already heard, but are willing to hear again. Mornings in third class began not with alarm clocks or orchestras, but with the soft sounds of humanity stirring. A baby's cry filtered through the thin walls, a cough, a murmured greeting, the scrape of boots on metal floors. Light didn't stream through grand windows here. It crept in, filtered and uncertain, like a polite visitor, unsure if it was welcome. You rose not because you wanted to, but because the air was alive with the scent of something warm, something edible, something that hinted, just barely, at comfort. There were no footmen to greet you, no bells to summon your presence. Instead, you followed the crowd, a kind of communal drift toward the source of that smell. Hot carbohydrates and the faint promise of tea. When you entered the dining saloon, it was quieter than usual, as if the room itself was still waking. A steward nodded in your direction, not warmly, but not dismissively either. He pointed to a seat, and you took it, joining the others in that morning ritual of shared silence and spoon-scraping. On the table before you, breakfast awaited. A generous portion of porridge, steaming and thick, filled your bowl. It had the consistency of something designed more for insulation than indulgence, a gluey paste with nutritional intentions. You didn't ask what it was made of. No one did. It was hot, that was enough. Alongside it came slices of bread, thick, firm, the kind of bread that defied knives and begged to be torn by hand. The margarine beside it was stubborn, pretending to be butter but fooling no one. Still, you spread it thinly and with reverence, as though grateful even for its charade. And then, of course, there was the tea. Always the tea. It arrived in heavy mugs, not delicate china, but dented tin or chipped ceramic. It was strong enough to make you pause after the first sip. A brew more about resilience than refreshment, as if boiled from bark, stubbornness, and a hint of regret. Yet it grew on you. It became the anchor of every meal, the thread that stitched together each day aboard. You sipped it slowly, letting it warm your hands as much as your belly, watching as others did the same. Sometimes, if the kitchen had overachieved, marmalade would appear. Not often and never in abundance. Just a small jar with a chipped rim, passed reverently from hand to hand like a sacred object. If your table got one, it was cause for quiet celebration. A smear of citrus brightness on dull bread could feel like a sunrise. It reminded you of joy, not joy itself, but its echo. Just enough. Breakfast did not offer variety. There were no eggs, no bacon, no sizzling sounds of a griddle or the smell of spice. But what it did offer was something rare. Certainty. You knew it would be there, that it would fill you, that it would sit in your gut like ballast against the rocking ship and the uncertain day ahead. And in that knowledge, you found something resembling peace. By midday, the porridge had long since settled, or perhaps solidified, in your stomach. The hours in between passed with walking, talking, or simply standing on deck watching the Atlantic rise and fall like an endless breath. You'd grown used to the sea now, to its rhythm, to its indifference. Hunger returned, not with a roar, but a familiar knock, and once again, the crowd stirred. In Edwardian times, what we'd call lunch, they called dinner. A hearty affair intended to fuel laborers and travelers alike. You joined the second wave, or perhaps the third. It no longer mattered. The saloon smelled of steam and hope, and that was all you needed to know. Soup came first. It was beige, always beige, as though color had been deemed unnecessary. You took a sip. It was hot, vegetable adjacent, and surprisingly comforting, like someone had boiled a garden and strained out the pretension. No one knew what exactly floated in it, and no one asked. It was enough that it was warm and that it didn't fight back. Then came the main course. A slab of roast beef, though calling it beef was generous. It had the texture of something that had fought valiantly before surrendering. You sawed at it with your knife, grateful that it had been sharpened sometime in the past decade. The meat was firm, fibrous, and determined to be filling whether you liked it or not. Next to it sat a mountain of boiled potatoes. Boiled, always, arranged like a defensive wall. Gravy poured over it all, thick and salty, not to enhance the flavor, but to bind everything together in a sort of edible cement. A few carrots rolled onto the plate. Or were they peas? No one really cared. The mere presence of color was a pleasant surprise. Bread returned, as it always did, as it always would. By now you and the bread had a relationship. You didn't love it, but you respected it. It was there when you needed it. Reliable, indestructible. It gave structure to the meal and purpose to your chewing. Around you the room had shifted. Breakfast had been quiet, focused, but lunch, dinner, was livelier. Voices rose, accents tangled in the air, Irish, Italian, Norwegian, Syrian, a symphony of ambition and exhaustion. You nodded when spoken to, even if you didn't understand. You raised your mug in silent toasts. Someone told a joke. You didn't catch it, but you laughed anyway. Because in that moment, you were part of something, not just a passenger, not just an immigrant, but a member of a floating community fueled by stew, starch, and the fragile hope of a better life. As the meal ended, you leaned back, not to savor, but to breathe. You were full, not in the sense of indulgence, but in the way that made you think you could make it another day. You wiped your mouth with your sleeve. Napkins were a luxury too far, and stood. The steward, quiet and swift, cleared your plate. Another shift waited. Another group of dreamers holding spoons. And so you walked out, the taste of salt and boiled something lingering, your stomach anchored, your spirit steadied. The Atlantic awaited, vast and unknowable. But for now, you were fed. And that was enough. By the time supper rolled around, the sun had already begun to disappear somewhere behind a horizon you'd never see. There were no grand views from F-deck, no panoramic windows catching the golden hour, no sunset glinting off crystal glasses. Down here, you measured time, not by light, but by routine. Supper didn't arrive with flourish or fanfare. It simply happened, like the tide or the turning of the earth. Inevitable, quiet, and strangely comforting. You had spent the day in motion, wandering the decks, losing at cards to someone far too young to be that skilled, dodging a child racing past with someone else's boot, and hearing two elderly men debate the finer points of whose suitcase had the strongest onion odor. Life in third class had a rhythm, unpredictable, but persistent. So by the time you returned to the dining saloon for the final meal of the day, you were ready, hungry perhaps, tired, definitely, grateful, always. Supper was not here to impress. It didn't need to be. It arrived with the simplicity of someone who knows their place in the world and isn't trying to be anything they're not. You took your seat at the long wooden table. Maybe the same one as before. Maybe not. They all blurred together eventually. Around you, familiar faces, unfamiliar words, and the universal sound of cutlery clinking against enamel plates. The food this time was reserved. Not cold, but not steaming. Slices of meat, thin and pinkish, were laid across your plate with the enthusiasm of someone who had already done this 600 times today and would do it 100 more. You didn't ask what kind of meat it was. That was a luxury best left to first class. It was meat-shaped. That would suffice. You chewed, not expecting surprise, but grateful for texture. The mystery of its origin was less important than the fact that it was there. Next came the cheese, white, soft, and mild to the point of anonymity. It neither offended nor delighted. It simply coexisted. Like many of you aboard, it asked nothing and promised little. It paired, predictably, with bread, the ever-present companion. By now, your relationship with that bread had matured. You no longer fought it. You understood it. It wasn't there to please. It was there to endure. And somehow, so were you. Then, inevitably, the tea. It returned like an old friend, always slightly too strong, always slightly too hot. You held it between both hands, not for flavor, but for the warmth it brought to your fingers, your chest, your thoughts. If there had been a dessert, it would have been a surprise. But there wasn't. Not even a prune, a raisin, a sugared biscuit. Sweetness was something for dreams, not dinner. And yet, no one complained. Not really. You'd stopped expecting more a long time ago. Somewhere nearby, a child hummed a tune, slightly off-key. Someone else snored, not rudely, just tiredly, mid-chew. Two young men at the far end of the bench debated in hushed tones whether this was the best meal they'd ever had. Judging by the seriousness of their expressions, it probably was. There was no wine, no ale. Officially, third class did not serve alcohol. It wasn't banned outright, but it was discouraged with policy and design. And yet, now and then, you'd see signs of it. A man nursing a small flask that glinted suspiciously when the steward turned away. A group of Irish boys returning from their walk on deck a little too cheerful, the smell of tea that burned the throat and tickled the nose. Officially, you were a teetotaler. Unofficially? The ship floated, and so did some spirits. But despite the absence of indulgence, supper offered something else, a soft close to the day. The saloon lights dimmed just slightly, as if acknowledging the hush that had settled over the room. Voices dropped, movements slowed. There was less urgency now, less scrambling for stew or chairs. Everyone seemed to agree, silently, to make this last meal a gentle one. You finished your plate, such as it was. You folded an imaginary napkin or brushed your hands against your trousers. The steward passed again, collecting the evidence of your meal without ceremony. And you lingered for just a moment longer, not because the food demanded it, but because the company did. This supper, like every other in third class, was modest. It was unembellished, but it was shared. That mattered more than flavor. It reminded you that even here, beneath the weight of wealth and class, something warm could still be found. A bowl of stew, a crust of bread, a hand passing the cup without being asked. As you stood and made your way back to your cabin, the engine's thrum followed you like a heartbeat. You were full, not in taste, but in feeling. Supper was not exciting, it was not elegant, but it was enough. And sometimes that was everything. It wasn't long before you started asking the question. Not aloud, of course, but in the way your eyes lingered on other tables or in the faint lift of an eyebrow when you saw someone smile too easily. Where's the beer? You were crossing the Atlantic after all. Beginning a new life. You'd eaten potatoes 3 times today and boiled cabbage twice. If ever a moment called for a drink, this felt like one. But third class on the Titanic was not a place of flowing ale or toasts with clinking glasses. Alcohol wasn't forbidden exactly. It was simply absent, strategically, quietly, firmly. You'd heard whispers, of course, rumors about a bar tucked into some forgotten corner of the ship, small, confusing, almost mythical in its rules and regulations. Apparently, it existed, technically. But to order something there, you had to be brave, fluent in bureaucratic mumbling, and perhaps a little lucky. Most didn't bother. And yet, alcohol still appeared, subtly, secretly, as if summoned by the desperation of the voyage itself. A man sitting across from you cradled a flask with the care of a priest holding a relic. A group of Irish lads returned from the deck with ruddy cheeks and laughter that bordered on song. One Italian claimed his tea had a spicy note, which could have been a misunderstanding of the English word whiskey, or just confidence in liquid form. You knew better than to ask. You sipped your standard-issue tea, strong and unsweetened, and nodded to those who passed their evening with a little more heat in their mugs. Sobriety, after all, had its perks. You remembered where your bed was. You avoided mistaking a lifeboat for an outhouse at 2 a.m. Small victories, perhaps, but victories nonetheless. Eventually, you stopped wondering what was for dinner and started wondering in how many forms stew could be reincarnated. Because on Titanic, especially in 3rd class, stew was not just a dish. It was a creed, a lifestyle, a recurring dream from which there was no waking. It came in many disguises. Irish stew, meat and vegetable, hot. Sometimes it arrived with visible chunks of turnip. Sometimes it arrived with mystery, but it always arrived. Stew was the one reliable thing in your day, second only to tea and disappointment in bread texture. It was not gourmet. It did not whisper of thyme or rosemary or wine reductions. It was a hot, dense soup of meat-like substance, root vegetables, and a sort of salt-infused determination. Sometimes it tasted like nourishment. Other times it tasted like surrender. But it filled you. That was enough. You learned quickly that the temperature of stew aboard Titanic was never accidental. It was either lava hot or fridge cold, with no regard for your tongue or expectations. You developed strategies: eat fast to beat the cooling, or wait and risk the stew solidifying into a form better suited for masonry than digestion. You noticed the reverence. Full-grown men staring silently into their bowls like monks in contemplation. Was that beef, mutton, parsnip with aspirations? You didn't ask. You simply consumed and nodded, bonded to your fellow diners by steam and silence. And somewhere in the background of this endless dance of spoons and potatoes, you began to notice something odd, something unexpected. The cutlery. Real cutlery. You had boarded this ship expecting the worst. You'd prepared for splintered sticks or hollowed turnip spoons. But here you were, holding a metal fork, a matching spoon. A knife, too, though blunt in the way that said, "Yes, technically I cut things." You stared at it the first time you received it, marveling at the weight, the gleam. It wasn't gold and it wasn't polished, but it matched. It was clean. It worked. Your plates were white enamel. Chipped, yes, but real. Dignified in their survival. They clinked against the table in a way that said, "This is a meal," not "This is rations." You began to cherish the sound. It meant hot food was coming. It meant someone in a kitchen you'd never see had boiled and ladled and delivered another round of edible perseverance. And then there was the mug. Every meal had one. Stout, handleless. A squat little cylinder of ceramic or tin, occasionally dented, always warm. It held tea, or water, or whatever brownish liquid was served next. But it also served as a hand warmer, a percussion instrument, and in rare cases, a tool of quiet self-defense. You grew fond of it, you missed it when it was gone. Napkins? Don't be greedy. You had your sleeve, you had your neighbor's sleeve, and you had hope that this time, just this once, the gravy wouldn't drip. The tables, bolted to the floor, refused to budge even in rough seas. The benches were communal, hard, and just uncomfortable enough to keep you from lingering too long. Eating in 3rd class wasn't just an act of nourishment. It was a full-body exercise in balance and restraint. And yet, despite the humble tools and limited offerings, there was something quietly noble about the ritual. You and dozens of others huddled around shared tables, passing spoons and glances. Eating with tools that had traveled with 14 nationalities and survived unwashed hands, unexpected elbows, and more than a few spilled stews. You didn't toss your cutlery when the meal was done. You laid it gently down, a small nod of respect. not just to the ship, but to yourself. Because this was the Titanic. And even in third class, even below decks and beneath chandeliers you'd never see, something inside you felt human, and maybe, for once, seen. At some point, probably while staring into your third bowl of stew in as many days, you began to wonder, who's making all this? Who's behind the curtain, boiling and chopping and stirring enough food to feed a small city, all of it on a ship moving steadily through ice-bitten waters? It wasn't just you who ate. Hundreds of third-class passengers. 3 meals a day. Hot, punctual. Somehow consistent. That wasn't cooking. That was orchestration. The answer, of course, lived far beneath the dining saloon, in the belly of the ship, buried behind steel bulkheads and steaming corridors, where the air clung to your skin and the walls sweated with effort. You wouldn't see it. No third-class passenger did. But the third-class galley existed like a hidden engine room of nourishment, its presence felt in every spoonful, every roll, every too-hot mug of tea. Down there, a small army moved with precision. Cooks, assistants, pot washers, and slicers. They weren't chefs in tall hats or men of culinary fame. They were working-class men and women with calloused hands, red knuckles, and eyes rimmed in steam. They didn't sign menus or invent recipes. They didn't need to. Their mission wasn't art. It was survival. Feed hundreds. Feed them fast. Feed them well enough. There were no culinary experiments, no flourishes of citrus zest or sprigs of herbs to finish a plate. If they had carrots, they used carrots. If they ran out of meat, they made do with potatoes and hope. The menus were fixed, the ingredients often stubborn. But the food came hot, it came steady, and that, on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, was nothing short of a miracle. The tools of their trade were less kitchen and more battlefield. Massive iron cauldrons that looked like they could house small livestock. Wooden paddles taller than a man, used to stir industrial stews. Bread trays wide enough to sled down the corridors if you had the nerve. And always, always the endless slicing. Potatoes, onions, more potatoes, and then more potatoes after that. One imagined a weary cook, elbow deep in broth, muttering encouragement to the carrots like a general before battle. You laughed at the image, but then you looked down at your plate, at the swirl of thick gravy and unidentifiable root, and realized that stew came from somewhere. Someone chopped that turnip. Someone ladled that bowl, and they did it again and again. 700 times a day. There were no second helpings. This wasn't a banquet. It was logistics. You received your portion, you smiled, or didn't, and you ate. But somewhere, just out of sight, someone was already preparing the next batch. The pot never stopped boiling. The ladle never stopped moving. In that galley, time was measured in servings, not seconds. The cooks themselves, you'd never meet them. Their names weren't recorded on the menu. There was no menu. But their presence was stamped into every dented ladle and soot-smudged bowl. They didn't chase glory. They chased consistency. They knew their work wasn't glamorous. But they did it because someone had to, because warm food could make all the difference between despair and perseverance. And you, sitting in that dining saloon with your tin mug and stiff bread, knew it too. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between mouthfuls, you lifted your spoon not just to eat, but to honor. A small, silent tribute to those anonymous heroes in the galley below. Sweating over flames and boiling pots, making sure that even in third class, even on the edge of the world, you had something warm to hold on to. You'd never thank them. You couldn't, but every clean plate, every satisfied sigh, every full stomach, that was thanks enough. After a few meals aboard Titanic, you began to feel it, the rhythm. A pattern not spoken, not posted, but pulsing beneath every meal. Sit, nod. Eat like time is running out. Leave. This was third class. There was no leisurely nibbling, no extended chat over tea and reflection. It wasn't that people were rude. Far from it. It was simply necessity. The dining saloon was large, but not infinite. 700 passengers needed to eat, and only so many could sit at once. So you learned quickly that meals were not just served. They were managed, like cargo, like lifeboats. There was no steward with a stopwatch, no bell to mark your moment. But the timing was clear in everything around you. The urgency of footsteps behind you, the glance from someone standing in the doorway, the scrape of cutlery being cleared before your final bite had left the spoon. No one shouted. No one told you to move. But you moved, because you weren't the only one hungry. Everyone did it. Head down, elbows tucked. Spoon to mouth. Rhythm steady. Chew just enough. Swallow. Repeat. You didn't linger over flavor. You didn't wait for conversation. You participated in what felt at times like synchronized survival. 100 people eating in parallel, moving with the strange precision of a tide drawn not by the moon, but by shared hunger. You weren't alone. The man next to you mumbled for the bread. The girl across the table reached for a spoon still warm from someone else's tea. Someone chuckled, quickly. Not because the joke was short, but because time was. Even laughter had to obey the schedule. It became a kind of etiquette, almost sacred. Speak if you must, but keep it brief. Pass what's needed. Don't interrupt the chewing. Most conversations were more sound than language, gestures, nods, one-word requests. Tea. Cabbage? Yours. You once tried to make eye contact with the steward, a thank you maybe, or just a human moment, but by the time your glance found his, he had vanished, plate in hand, ghosting into the kitchen like a man fleeing a crime. These stewards were machines of motion, silent, efficient, invisible until needed and gone before you noticed. And there was no judgment. No one rolled their eyes if you ate too fast or too slow, but you learned. You watched others. You saw the veterans, those who had already weathered a few crossings perhaps. They dismantled meals like clockmakers. 2 minutes for stew, 1 for bread. Tea drank in 3 swallows, spaced between bites to soften the edges of salt and dryness. They didn't speak. They performed. You copied them. You learned when to eat the bread, when to wait for the stew to cool, just enough not to burn, but not so long it turned to glue. You watched for the signs. A cough behind you, a shifted foot, a plate placed slightly too loud. Time's up, stew soldier. The next shift is waiting, so you nodded to your neighbors. A silent farewell among strangers who would never know your name but had shared a table and a task. You stood. You stepped aside. And someone else took your place without missing a beat. In third class, meals weren't just about food. They were movement. They were choreography. They were a delicate balance between efficiency and grace. And even in that pressure, in the unspoken urgency, there was something beautiful. Because when 700 people agree to share, to shift, to wait their turn and not steal your seat, that's not just coordination. That's community, even if it's made of cabbage. You might have boarded Titanic expecting to eat alongside people like you, neighbors in dialect, in dress, in dreams. But third class on this ship was a continent in itself, a swirling, steaming gathering of the world's overlooked and uprooted. The dining room wasn't merely a mess hall. It was a collision of languages, cultures, and lives caught in motion, each with its own story written in hunger and steam. You took your place at a long wooden table beside a Swedish carpenter who ate like a watchmaker, precise, measured, never spilling a crumb. Across from him, an Irish widow managed 5 children and a spoon with the efficiency of a field marshal. Next to her, a Serbian grandmother said little, but wielded her eyebrows like weapons, arching in approval or flattening into disapproval at the state of your spoon grip. No one knew each other's names. But within 5 minutes of sitting down, something unspoken had settled among you, a contract of courtesy, respect, and shared purpose. Don't take too much. Laugh quietly. Never judge another person's way with margarine. There was no assigned seating. You sat where space allowed. Today it might be beside a man in a wool coat from Galicia. Tomorrow, a mother from Syria, her child fast asleep on her lap while she ate one-handed. The tables, bolted down and wide enough to carry food but not formality, became tiny embassies of shared resilience. You didn't talk much, and when you did, you rarely understood one another. But somehow, meaning slipped through anyway. Voices rose and fell in Italian, Polish, Norwegian, Arabic. At times, it felt like the entire ship was singing in 50 dialects at once. You heard prayers before meals, whispered blessings in 5 different tongues before the same stew. And when words failed, a shrug, a smile, or the passing of a spoon said enough. You learned that salt might not be salt, that bread, when shared, required no translation. That silence, when respectful, could be the most fluent of all. Occasionally, someone would try for conversation. A few questions traded between spoonfuls. Where are you headed? Who did you leave behind? Do you think this bread could stop a bullet? The answers were slow to come, not just because of language, but because every person in that room was carrying a different mixture of fear and hope. And some weights were harder to speak aloud. But even without names or common words, you remembered things. The way the Italian girl laughed when the bread tore just right. The way the Norwegian boy offered his marmalade without being asked. The way the Serbian woman looked at you after your second spoon slipped. Not angry, not amused, but as if to say, "You'll learn." And somehow, in this room of strangers stitched together by immigration and boiled food, you did learn. You learned to make space, to share water, to listen with your hands and your eyes, to exist alongside difference not with suspicion, but with a kind of quiet reverence. Because in this room, filled with languages and longing, there were no walls of class, no linen to divide you, no orchestra to drown you out. Just shared cutlery, clinking mugs, and the understanding that survival, physical, emotional, spiritual, required more than calories. It required community, even if it only lasted the length of a meal. So you ate beside strangers who became companions, if only for 20 minutes. You passed the bread, you nodded at the stew, you smiled at jokes you didn't understand, and you left the table just a little fuller, not just in body, but in the strange, tender knowledge that you are not alone. Sooner or later, you started to wonder. It crept in quietly, like the chill on the stairwell or the flicker of jealousy when someone mentioned dessert. You tried not to ask, tried not to care. But the question persisted, circling your thoughts like a seagull waiting for scraps. What are they eating up there? Upstairs, above the tiled floors and dented mugs of F-deck, the passengers of first class were living in another world. One of 10-course menus, delicately folded napkins, and wine pairings that came with backstories. You'd heard whispers, baked apples stuffed with sugared almonds, peach compote glistening in bowls shaped like swans. Words you'd never spoken aloud now drifted around you like ghosts. Aspic, foie gras, consommé. You weren't sure if they were meals or illnesses. Meanwhile, down here, dessert was a myth. You weren't hoping for cake. You would have settled for pudding, even the grey jiggling kind. But instead, your meals ended when the last spoonful of stew stuck to the plate like a final insult. Sweetness didn't visit third class. If someone dropped a raisin on the floor, you might have considered fencing over it. There were no choices either. No menus, no polite waiters asking, "The beef or the lamb, madam?" You received what was made, no substitutions. You didn't get to protest or request. If you didn't like the stew, Well, that was an internal matter. Perhaps one to discuss with your conscience or the ship's pipes. Complaints went nowhere. Besides, you had a spoon, didn't you? That was enough.
Even the service upstairs was different. In first class, the stewards introduced themselves, whispered about the cut of meat, described each course like a sonnet. In third class, your steward appeared with the stealth of a cat, dropped your plate and vanished like mist. He had 600 others to feed. He wasn't there to chat about broth. The tables up there were draped in linen. The ones down here were wiped down with whatever cloth hadn't been used to plug a leak or carry tea. Their silverware sparkled. Yours existed. If it matched, it was a good day. Napkins were fabric up top. Yours was whatever sleeve you weren't using to hold a child or your mug. And then there was the fruit. Not a slice, not a hint. In first class, they passed grapes across white plates like currency. Oranges were peeled with golden forks. You weren't even sure you remembered what citrus tasted like. Down here, a banana would cause a riot. A single apple would become legend. You knew it wasn't personal, it was class. It was the old world reaching into the new, reminding everyone where they stood, even on a ship built for possibility. You had paid less. You got less. That was the deal. No frills, no sweetness, just warmth, bread, and space. And yet, strangely, it wasn't bitter. Not really. There were no violins in your dining room, but there were stories, real ones. There was laughter, even if it was brief. There was a plate, a spoon, a neighbor who passed the bread without being asked. You were fed. You were warm. You belonged not to society, maybe, but to each other. Upstairs, they ate peaches soaked in liqueur. Down here, someone gave you the crustiest piece of bread because they thought you looked hungrier. That meant something. And so, while part of you ached to taste what luxury felt like, another part, the part that had known hunger, cold, and invisibility, found comfort in this strange, plain dignity. The food might not be elegant, the service might be rushed, but the room was full of people just like you. Not royalty, not gentry, just humans chasing a new life. And somehow, that was enough to soften even the hardest bread. Sunday, April 14th, began like the days before it, with porridge, footsteps, children crying in too many languages, and steam curling above tea. No one knew the date would become history. Not yet. You woke, you dressed in yesterday's clothes, you followed the scent of breakfast like always. The sea was calm, the air steady. The ship moved forward, unbothered, unaware. The day passed in its usual drift. Some played cards. Some walked the outer deck, bundled against the breeze. A woman mended a sleeve beside a window that didn't open. A man read the same page of a letter, eyes unfocused. No one was in a rush. Why would they be? Titanic moved with confidence, the kind of confidence that made clocks seem optional and lifeboats invisible. Dinner that evening came just like the others. There was no omen in the stew, no warning in the bread. But something about it, or maybe the way it all felt so normal, stayed with you longer than usual. You sat where you always sat, maybe at the edge of the bench, where you had a better chance at tea. The saloon was bright with the electric calm you'd grown used to, no flickering lights, no rattling, just a low murmur of forks against enamel and stories half told in shared language. You ate beside the same strangers you'd begun to call familiar, even if you didn't know their names. Someone was celebrating an engagement. Someone else played a tune on a harmonica. A child had spilled their tea and seemed delighted by the attention. The food was the same. More stew, thicker than usual maybe, or maybe you were imagining things. The bread, possibly fresher. Or maybe it just felt softer because your fingers were less cold. Roast pork appeared, if that's what it was. The gravy clung to everything like it didn't want to say goodbye. You chatted with the man beside you, a quick joke about how they must be fattening you up for the new world. He laughed. You smiled. The joke wasn't very good. That wasn't the point. The air in the dining room held a quiet warmth. Not temperature, though the stew helped, but mood. The kind that makes people linger just a moment longer than they need to. Parents hushed babies, young men traded dreams about jobs in America, Older passengers stared into their tea like they were reading fortunes in the leaves. It was the kind of evening that felt like an ending without saying so. When your plate was cleared, you rose like always. Not with ceremony, but with the practiced movement of someone who knew how to make room for the next. You rubbed your hands on your trousers, you thought about breakfast. Maybe you'd get marmalade again. Maybe you'd finally get the early shift. The dining room emptied slowly. Someone left a harmonica behind. Someone else forgot their cup. But overall, it looked as it always had, clean, humble, lit by electric calm. No one knew it would never serve another meal. No one knew it had just hosted its last gathering of stew, silence, and scattered dreams. The ship steamed on. Outside, the North Atlantic waited, dark and endless. Inside, the third-class dining saloon faded to quiet, unaware it had just become a memory. Long after the plates were cleared and the benches stood empty, something about the dining saloon lingered. Not its appearance, which was plain, or the food, which was often indistinct. It was something else, something quieter. For many third-class passengers, that room became the last place where life still felt ordinary. You didn't know that, of course. You weren't thinking in terms of lasts. You were thinking about whether tomorrow's bread might be softer, whether the stew would include something green for once. You were thinking about your sister's shoes, lost again, or the boy who kept claiming his spoon could bend by thought alone. You were thinking about the bunk you'd return to, the voices that filled the corridor, the shuffle of people preparing for another day of the same. But the dining room had become more than routine. It had become rhythm. It gave shape to the days in a place where time didn't matter. There were no windows in that room, no clocks, no shadows to mark the sun's passing. But the stew came when it was supposed to. The bread arrived when you expected it. The tea was poured, hot and brown, into the same dented mugs with the same predictable slosh. And in a world where predictability was rare, that meant something. You could pretend, if only for the length of a meal, that this was your future. Not New York, not jobs waiting in strange cities. But here, a table, a chair, a bowl of food, people who sat beside you and asked nothing more than a share of butter or a nod of thanks. You didn't know them, but you knew the way they moved. You recognized the weight they carried. You mirrored their manners not out of etiquette but respect. You didn't dress up for meals. You had nothing to change into, but you sat straighter. You held your cutlery with care. You wiped your mouth on your sleeve and passed the bread as if passing a baton in a relay where the prize was not dropping crumbs. Dignity bloomed in that room, quiet as steam. You were never called sir, never asked your preference, but you were fed, on time, with clean utensils, in light that never flickered. For some, it was the cleanest place they'd ever eaten. For others, the warmest. And for nearly everyone, the safest. You might have crossed countries by foot or rail to be here. You might have hidden from soldiers, left behind graves, borrowed money you didn't have just to board. But here, in this tiled, echoing room, no one asked where you came from. They asked instead if you wanted more bread. That was the language of survival and of grace. No one took photographs in third class. No artists came to sketch the bread. The menus weren't printed. The walls weren't carved. But in memory, this room would take on strange importance. Not because it was grand, but because it was normal. The last normal place. And when people remembered Titanic in the years to come, they would speak of music and marble staircases, of crystal and candles, but some, the quiet some, would remember this room. The benches bolted down, the bowls chipped but clean, the way you ate elbow to elbow with the world and didn't feel small, the way it smelled of soap and potatoes, the way someone you didn't know passed you the spoon without looking, like you belonged. And for many, that was the last time they did. After everything, the laughter, the stew, the tea that tasted like boiled ambition, what remained? The answer for most was nothing. The third-class dining saloon, like so much else on the Titanic, did not survive. It sits now somewhere beneath miles of salt water and silence, entombed in cold blackness, lost beneath layers of pressure and time. No photos, no menus, no recipes, No ornate chandeliers or gilded panels to draw explorers back with cameras and lights, just steel, salt, and ghost memory. When the world heard that the great ship had gone down, all eyes turned upward to the staircase, to the orchestra, to the men in tuxedos and the women in lace who faced death with poise and pearls. It made sense. That was the theater of the story, tragedy in its most dramatic form. But far below, on F deck, in a white-walled room with long tables and benches that didn't move, there were stories too. They just didn't get written down. No one recorded what soup was served that night. No one kept the spoon that passed from hand to hand. No one memorialized the last loaf of bread, split between a Swedish girl with dreams of Chicago and a Greek man hoping to join his cousins in New Jersey. But they were there. They sat together, they ate together. And when the world above began to tilt, they were still chewing, still sipping, still hopeful. Some who survived would later speak of it, not often, and not in the grand language of historians, but in fragments. They remembered the brightness of the room, how strange it was that the floor was tiled and clean. They remembered the bread, the stew, the way people moved aside so others could sit. A woman later said that was the last place she felt safe. A man said it was the only meal he ever ate with so many nations at one table. The benches were never recovered. The plates went down with the ship. No Latin inscriptions, no silver cutlery, just enamel, tin, wood. But those things held weight. They had mattered. They had made people feel human at a time when humanity wasn't always given freely to the poor. The dining saloon of third class was not glamorous. It didn't need to be. It was shared. It was warm. It had light. And for hundreds of passengers, it was the last place that life felt familiar. There are no relics from that room in museums, no guided tour in replica halls, no oil paintings of boiled carrots or margarine mistaken for butter. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it, not the clang of wealth, but the clatter of tin mugs, the low hum of many accents trying to say pass the bread, the soft hiss of steam rising from stew, the quiet thanks before eating. It was the sound of the world, compressed into one room, trying to believe in tomorrow. The third-class dining saloon on Titanic did not die with a great roar or blaze. It did not fracture dramatically in the moonlight or echo with violin music as the ship broke apart. It vanished quietly, like so many things belonging to the poor. It slipped beneath the Atlantic in silence, carrying with it chipped plates, scorched pots, unfinished cups of tea, and the soft echoes of 100 different accents asking for bread. But even in its disappearance, the room endures. It lives not in photographs or artifacts because there are none. It lives in memory, not just personal but collective. The shared memory of what that space offered. For many passengers, it was the last room where things still made sense. The last time someone smiled at them without fear. The last place where their children laughed. The last meal they would ever eat, seated, warm with others. It wasn't gilded. It wasn't celebrated. But it was human. It was a room where a Syrian mother sat beside an Irish laborer, where a Polish boy whispered jokes to a Dutch girl, and a Norwegian widow bowed her head over soup, where no one asked for credentials and no one corrected your grammar, where the food was plain, but the feeling, the sheer shared experience of it, made the room glow with something richer than chandeliers. It was, perhaps, the only part of the ship where community happened by accident, not design. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because need forced people together. And what bloomed from that necessity was something beautiful, the quiet dignity of strangers who helped one another eat. When people speak of Titanic, they speak of tragedy, engineering, hubris. But to forget the third-class saloon is to forget why the ship mattered at all. Because Titanic wasn't just a vessel of steel and brass. It was a vessel of lives, of dreams packed into suitcases, of families squeezed onto benches, of men and women who crossed oceans with nothing but a spoon, a story, and a hope. That dining saloon, with its long tables, its flickering lamps, its steam-thick air, was where those hopes were fed. And even after everything was lost, those moments remained. In memory, in silence, in the simple, echoing truth that a room without chandeliers still mattered, that bread passed hand to hand in the dim light can be just as sacred as silver service. And though it rests now in darkness, beneath weight and water, that room, that humble painted room still speaks, not in words but in warmth,